Process for considering our first bill of the 118th Congress reflects our commitment to Americans and an open legislative process. Now let's focus on what this bill does. It repeals the vast majority of the Internal Revenue Service funding Democrats enacted last year in order to pay for their Green New Deal.
So this is theater tonight, Mr. Speaker. If we didn't get enough of the entertainment factor last week, we're going to proceed with it again this evening. 87,000 IRS agents. Let me debunk that right away. There are regular retirements of up to 8,000 a year. We're replacing them. How about the methodology of a computer upgrade, an investment in technology, more modeling? Or should we have an IRS that operates the way Southwest Airlines did last week? 86% of the American people, Mr. Speaker, they pay their taxes every year on time. Do you know why? Because they get paid in wages and it comes from withholding taxes. That's what it's about. The American people are wise to what's being presented here tonight. We live in a two-tier tax system. Wage earners follow the rules. Wealthy billionaires, they get to skirt their responsibilities, and that's what we're being asked to vote on tonight. IRS funding has been stagnant. Staffing levels have dropped. Have you tried getting an IRS office on the phone? How many times will we continue to let those at the top get away without paying their share? We lose out, just think of it again, almost $600 billion a year in unpaid taxes. It's very sophisticated tax planning that is done by high-priced attorneys and CPAs. It's estimated that this could be up to $7 trillion because we score items over the course of 10 years. So what might this funding pay for? How about Social Security? How about Medicare? How about a strong military? How about a child tax credit that could be expanded? How about universal paid family and medical leave? And how about bringing down health care costs?
The last thing that these small businesses can afford right now is 87,000 new IRS agents not only targeting their enterprises, but targeting their livelihoods. With 11 million tax returns still awaiting IRS action, the IRS should be focusing on doing their job rather than weaponizing their agency.
This first Republican bill should be known as the Protect Donald Trump and His Tax Cheating Cronies Act. After years of obstructing access to Donald Trump's tax returns, we learned how little he paid toward the cost of our national security and how poorly the Trump Internal Revenue Service enforced our tax laws. Each year, the richest 1% in our country avoid paying an incredible $160 billion of the taxes they owe. This crime wave of Trump-style tax cheating is made possible by Republican insistence on defunding the revenue police. Over the past decade, audit rates for corporations are down by half, the ultra-rich by 3/4. Republican claimed interest in law and order seems to vanish when it comes to tax fraud by the wealthiest few. And their very first bill adds $114 billion to our deficit.
The gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in full support of H.R. 23, which rescinds the additional funding for the already inflated IRS. I think we can all agree that the last thing Americans need right now is a government who is actively working against them.
The gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in full support of H.R. 23, which rescinds the additional funding for the already inflated IRS. I think we can all agree that the last thing Americans need right now is a government who is actively working against them.
I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statement of the administration's policy opposing H.R. 23.
Without objection.
A CBO score for this bill showing that it will add $114 billion to the federal deficit over the next 10 years.
Without objection.
Thank you. An op-ed piece from the former IRS Commissioner Charles Rettig, a Republican, entitled "IRS Sets the Record Straight. We're going after tax evaders, not honest Americans."
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this misguided, expensive, and unpaid-for legislation. For years, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have done everything they can to demonize the IRS. But here's the reality. When the IRS doesn't have the funding it needs, two very bad things happen. The very wealthy tax cheats are able to avoid paying their fair share, and two, our constituents who need help from the IRS face unnecessary and disruptive delays in getting that help. You can't criticize the IRS for its performance while simultaneously fighting to cut the IRS budget. And despite what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would lead you to believe, there aren't 87,000 stormtroopers funded in this bill that are going to bang down your door. That is pure and utter nonsense.
It wasn't long ago that Washington was under one-party rule. This chamber was recently under the leadership of the Democrat Party that worked to give D.C. bureaucrats more power and wanted to hire an army of IRS agents to harass and audit my constituents while ignoring the need for more border agents to address the crisis at our southern border. My constituents don't need a supercharged IRS that will investigate their transaction between friends and sic 87,000 new agents on them.
This debate about IRS lends itself to being the most dishonest, demagogic rhetoric that I see in the Congress at any point in time. I rise as the former chairman of the Treasury Postal Committee, now the Financial Services and General Government Committee, to which I will return, having left the majority leader's spot. This bill is a bad bill. Every small American taxpayer ought to be for this bill, because this bill will make sure that others pay their fair share as they do. That's the issue. They're paying their fair share, as the chairman noted, because we take it out of their salary. But the people who get it through dividends and capital gains, et cetera, they've got the lawyers, the accountants, and the people who can tell them how not to pay their fair share. This is a bill against small business. This is a bill against
Gentleman's
the small
time has
taxpayer.
expired.
This is against paying your fair share.
Republicans made a promise to the American people to fight for working-class families. And we made a promise that our first order of business under a new Republican majority would be repeal the $80 billion Democrats gave the IRS to hire 87,000 new agents to target American working-class families. We are delivering on that promise today. This bill rescinds the IRS funds in the Inflation Reduction Act. And under the Biden administration, they threaten to snoop into the bank accounts of millions of middle-class families. We know this because President Biden wrote such a proposal into his first budget as part of his agenda to expand the power of the IRS and shovel billions more to this troubled agency. At that time, we asked the Joint Committee on Taxation how many Americans might be subject to such a scheme to spy into the bank accounts. The JCT said up to 134 million taxpayers could be targeted.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a blog post by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities summarizing the fact check that have repeatedly debunked the false claim that we just heard a few seconds ago that the IRS is going to hire 87,000 new agents immediately, and a factcheck.org article confirming that not all of the 87,000 people that will be hired are going to work on enforcement.
I think he used the right words when he talked about theater. And isn't it long overdue that we're honest with the American people about what this is about? Come on. You can't really believe that what you're proposing here isn't shielding the wealthiest people in this nation and corporations. People at Augie and Ray's in East Hartford are not fooled by this, and they understand what the agenda is. You place us further in debt and leave us with little else to do to help the people who need it the most. And what is this a guise for? Cutting what you call entitlements. What people in Augie and Ray's know are earned benefits that they pay for every single week out of their paycheck, where they pay their taxes.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired.
This bill defends American taxpayers against an unchecked, supercharged IRS and prioritizes customer service and tax return processing, two of the agency's most important functions. Included in the Democrats' Reckless Inflation Reduction Act this past summer, the IRS received an additional $80 billion in funding, with over half directed towards enforcement. What's worse, the Democrats' bill failed to include any safeguards to protect low and middle-income taxpayers from being unfairly targeted for tax audits. While the IRS continues to beef up their audit division, the agency still has 3.7 million unprocessed tax returns and a total of 11.1 million returns awaiting action. This is simply unacceptable.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, precisely the point that we've attempted to make. The customer service is not occurring because the IRS has been cut by 30% over the last 15 years. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from the IRS Commissioner to the House of Representatives confirming that the IRS will not raise audit rates on those making under $400,000 a year.
Without objection.
The Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act is a sham. The facts are that this legislation will shield tax cheats at the expense of working families. The last time Republicans were in charge, they systematically defunded IRS. The agency lost nearly 20% of its funding, shed more than 20,000 employees, and the audit rate for millionaires dropped 70%. And we heard one of our Republican colleagues make that point. This legislation will enable those at the top of the heap to be able to remember the taxes they should have reported. It raises, as we've heard, $187 billion in revenue. This bill, if enacted, would add to the deficit $114 billion because it is misguided and misdirected and wrong.
This new Republican majority is focused on protecting taxpayers and small businesses from overreach and abuse. Blocking the Biden administration from unleashing 87,000 new IRS agents on taxpayers is a crucial first step towards fulfilling our commitment to America.
I mean, it's stunning that what you've peddled, those falsehoods, and you seek at the same time to add $114 billion to the deficit. The chairman said it. Everybody said it. Republican budget cuts have left the IRS with 2,284 fewer skilled auditors to keep wealthy taxpayers from cheating than it had in 1954. That makes no sense. The GOP plan would aid and abet a flood of tax cheating by Wall Street tycoons. That would be the direct impact of this bill. Thankfully, it's going to be dead on arrival when it goes to the other side of the building.
Mr. Speaker, on March 1st, 2022, President Biden made a promise to the American people during the State of the Union address before a joint session of Congress. I was sitting in this room as the President stated, in quote, "Under my plan, nobody earning less than $400,000 a year will pay an additional penny in new taxes. Nobody," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the President lied to us all, because in August of 22, CBO confirmed that the Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act, which supercharges the IRS with 87,000 new agents, will in fact lead to more audits and enforcement measures.
The funding provided through the Inflation Reduction Act is an important step to address the lack of resources for the IRS so that they can do their job. How many of us have called the IRS and been on the phone waiting for hours only to be told that you were being transferred to yet another department and also continue to be waiting? Over the past year, the IRS has already been cut by 15%, and more cuts means more delays and lack of services for our constituents. As Representative Neal said, the IRS failed to collect over $500 trillion last year alone because of lack of resources, lack of compliance, and targeting of those people who are less fortunate through the EIT compliance. They have been hurt.
But in order to do that, you have to raise revenue. And this bill became a ploy to leverage the IRS to be able to to essentially do that without directly raising taxes.
I'm a small manufacturing business owner, and I've also worked as a tax attorney, so I know firsthand the kind of power that the IRS has over our small business owners and lower and middle income taxpayers. Last year, to fund their left-wing agenda, the Democrats in Congress decided to spend your hard-earned tax dollars on 87,000 new IRS agents, making the IRS the size nearly of the U.S. Marine Corps.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise to strongly oppose this misnamed Republican bill, which purports to protect families and small businesses, but instead continues the unrelenting effort to starve the IRS. The only Americans that this protects are tax cheats. And what's up with this conversation about how many agents are going to be added? The IRS has fewer agents today than it had in 1953, and our economy is 7 times larger, and our population is more than doubled since then. The characterization of the IRS as a militant government agency deployed to harass willing small business America is a flagrant lie.
Mr. Speaker, I want to clarify what exactly this bill is doing. Last year, Congress gave an additional $80 billion to the IRS on top of $12 billion of existing funding, which increased the IRS budget by almost 8 times. This bill still keeps almost $10 billion in additional funding to modernize IRS, which is still almost doubling their $12 billion budget, but eliminates over $70 billion of wasteful and egregious aggression against the American taxpayer by the federal government. As someone who spent over a decade in public accounting and also started my own businesses, I never felt that we don't have enough government. On the contrary, I hear the same message when I go all across my district. Small businesses and entrepreneurs have a hard time surviving.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this absurd legislation. The bill before us will cut the necessary investments to make the IRS more responsive to regular people, improve customer service, and work through the IRS backlog. And in exchange for making the IRS less responsive to the people, the bill is going to add $114 billion to the deficit, according to the CBO. And why? My Republican friends want us to believe that a horde of 87,000 armed federal agents are ready to kick in your doors for tax enforcement. This is a total nonsense, a fantasy, a fabrication that has been fact-checked over and over again and always found false.
The idea, Mr. Speaker, of hiring 87,000 new IRS agents to close the tax gap is misguided. I served as Revenue Secretary for the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We did, in fact, close the tax gap through what proved to be very effective measures. These included improving IT systems and processes which truly determined tax evasion from tax avoidance, largely taking the easy approach of hiring 87,000 new agents, doubling the size of the IRS. I don't know who thinks that's a good idea. It does not improve the quality of information used to accomplish the goal of collecting all tax revenues that are due.
But what scares me on this bill are the numbers. Okay, right now the IRS has about 78,000 employees, of which about 10,000 are what they describe as agents. It's not surprising that it's less than you had in 1954, because in 1954 everything was computerized.
Because it not only increases our national deficit by $114 billion, but it does so by helping the wealthiest avoid paying taxes and transfers that burden onto the backs of hardworking Americans and small businesses who follow the law and pay their taxes on time.
On this vote, the yeas are 221 and the nays are 210. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table.